everyone, welcome to the studio. My name is Penny, I'm with CabinQuilters.com, and today I'd like to start a new series called Beginner Quilting 101. Now, this series is going to be for basic beginners, but if you've used a sewing machine before, you don't have to fade away or turn away. I am going to, as they say in The Sound of Music, start at the very beginning because it's a very, very good place to start. And so for those of you who maybe just retired or you just decided you wanted to start quilting and you just want to get the basics down pat, understanding everything that you need to know to do quilting, or if you, let's say you retired or over COVID you picked up a sewing machine and you kind of learned, but maybe you found over the course of the last few years that when you enter a quilt shop, you just don't feel completely confident either in picking fabrics or color, or maybe you don't know all the terms that you need to know and you just don't feel like you got something. That's okay. So this class, this little series is all for you. So if you want to learn everything there is to know about quilting from the very, very start all the way up to the end, this is where you're going to want to learn. And we're going to set up the playlist for you. The playlist is going to be Beginner Quilting 101. And we've already got a couple of videos in there already, just basic things that I taught during my other series, 100 Quilt Blocks in 2025. I've thrown in a few basics in there, and there maybe if you're in the very beginning stages, those are a little bit too advanced for you, but there's going to be tidbits that I'm going to throw in there all the time to help make you more comfortable. But today's video is right at the very beginning. It's really designed to get you understanding what quilting is and understanding a little bit of the lingo of quilting, and then each series is going to have a title on it. So if you're ready to start Beginner Quilting 101, just stick around and let's get started. I'm really glad that you stuck around. So let's talk a little bit about quilting. And I'm not a quilt historian or anything, but just so you know where I'm coming from, I have been a quilt pattern designer for the last 22 years. So I have been fully immersed in the quilting community from the front side, retail, teaching, lecturing, to the back side, wholesale, distribution, fabric sales, all of it. So I have a lot of knowledge to impart, and I can do other series. If there's something that you're really dying to learn, definitely leave me a comment, because we're basing all of the videos that we do for you. So if there's something you want to learn about, definitely put it in the comments, because we will get to it eventually in some form or another. But to start at the very beginning, we have to talk about a little bit of the history of quilting. And quilting, some people say that it started in the 70s, some people say it started in the 1800s. There's so many different debates. There's lots of different books on history of quilting when it comes to the Civil War and slave times and hobo culture in the 20s, and all of those different historical books that are out there that have people that have actually researched the information that can provide you with all that. So if the history of quilting is of interest to you, I can definitely point you to a few books we'll talk about at the end where you can learn a little bit more. So quilting in its original form goes back thousands of years. There's evidence that it existed in ancient Egypt and in China. It was mostly for warmth or for padding, for protection. That's how it started. It's vastly different from quilting that we know today. Quilting became more widespread in Europe during the Crusades, and a lot of that was protection and warmth, and so those quilted garments would fit underneath armor, and it helped to add that layer of protection against the armor itself, as well as between the body and the armor. Now, patchwork, which we'll talk about mostly today, has roots in ancient China and ancient Egypt. There are carvings that depict rulers in ancient civilizations with quilted garments on. The oldest quilt that I know of is called the Tristan quilt, and it dates back to the 14th century. Now we'll fast forward many, many years to colonial America, where quilting in its form that we know it today, or patchwork, was really a practical skill. And that was for building garments, building bedding, things like that. And there's lots of different fabrics that were used. Oftentimes it was scraps from the clothing that we wore. And in the case of the 1930s, feed sacks for feed were actually developed in pretty fabrics because companies realized that women were taking the feed sacks apart and making them into garments. So they printed pretty fabrics on those feed sacks so that at least when women built dresses, that they would look somewhat more attractive than just wearing a simple feed sack. In the 19th century, quilting evolved again with the advent of lots of applique, and that kind of depicted stories or pictures or different types of things. They told a lot of different stories, and oftentimes generations of families and their family tree was depicted in those quilts. Now, modern quilting in the 20th and 21st century, we use the quilts for our beds. We're still using these as quilted garments and household items, but we've also developed a form of art expression. So modern quilters use this as another medium to create art that people love to look at. So that's our brief little history lesson that I wanted to get into. And like I said, if you're a historical person and you want to get into history, there are so many different block books and story books. And if you've been following along with the 100 Blocks in 2025, we use the Farmer's Wife book a lot. There are tons and tons of stories in that book earlier in the earlier pages of the book that explain what all the blocks are about. And there are histories to all of these blocks and how they're named. And many of the blocks go by many, many different names. And the Farmer's Wife is what I have right here. So in the beginning chapter, you can see all of the stories. There is a supplemental Farmer's Wife book, which is a medallion quilt that looks like this on the back. And again, all the blocks have different stories that you can read if you're interested in that. I also have a Civil War diary book. These are all 6-inch blocks. And inside there, this is an actual diary with passages from people in the Civil War and their dates. And I also have a book here called Hobo Quilts. And this is back in the 20s, 1918, 1920, 1922, different stories and blocks that meant different things that women used to hang over railings and things like that to let people know whether people were friendly in that house or not. So there's so many different, tons and tons of books. These are just a few of the ones that I have that can help you with the stories of quilting. Now, over the course of this unit, we're going to talk a lot about vocabulary terms. In some subsequent videos, we're going to learn about fabric and the different terms for the different parts of fabric, the terms for different parts of sewing machine. We're going to learn all of those things to help you hone your skills. But today we're just going to talk about the basics of quilting. And sometimes quilting can be just a little bit confusing because that word can mean so many different things. So quilting itself is the act of creating the quilt, but it also is the act of sewing all the layers of the quilt together. So when we're sewing pieces of fabric together to put them together into the body of the quilt, we have to call that piecing. It is also the act of quilting. So both of those terms can be used simultaneously, but patchwork and piecing is what we call putting the little parts back together. So some would tell you that quilting just means buying really good fabric and then cutting it up and sewing it back together again. And essentially, that is what we're doing. Sewing is also a combination term because sewing, most of us think of sewing as being with a sewing machine, but again, you know, years ago when we didn't have electricity, we didn't use sewing machines. We used a needle and thread. And now, even now, to this day, we have people that do some hand piecing, and I'm going to show you a little bit of that in this video today, putting things together by hand. Now, you may think, why would you put something together by hand when you can use a perfectly good sewing machine? Well, when you're sewing with a sewing machine, you have to be somewhere where there's electricity. You have to have a table to put it on. You have to have a chair to sit in. You have to have all those things. And it makes the act of sewing with sewing machine just a little less portable. So for those of us that maybe live life on the go, maybe we travel a lot, or we go to see our grandchildren or our children play on the side of a soccer field or at a swim meet, by sewing by hand, you can pretty much take everything you need in a little box. And so it makes the act of quilting very, very portable. And in some cases, sewing by hand can actually be faster than sewing by machine because of our busy lives. So we touched a little bit on quilting, and quilting can be the stitches that actually go down through the layers of the quilt, which we call the quilt sandwich, and I'm going to show you a little bit of that. And then we have binding, and binding is going to be the part that binds it all together at the end that makes a finished product. So let me show you a few of the finished quilts that I have here and the parts of the quilts so that you can understand what I'm talking about. So here on the table, I've recently, for one of the classes, made this beautiful table runner. This is half of it. Here's the other half. So this is what we'd call a top. So you can see that it's perfectly good fabric that I cut up and sewed back together into different parts, and it's just a single layer of fabric. So here are all the seams on the back that I sewed together. So this is the front side of the top, this is the back side or the underside of the top, and when we sew something like this together, which is essentially the decorative part of the quilt, we call this the top. And this is definitely quilting or piecing. So this is complete now as a table runner. So I would call this piecing the top. This is a pieced top, but it is small. It's just a table runner. But when we put everything together, it goes together in a quilt. And here is a finished quilt. And as you can see, I have the same thing that I have with my top over here. Lots of little pieces of fabric that have been put back together. But when we look on the other side, we no longer see those stitches. And that is because we have layered it together with a fabric back. We call this the back or the backing of the quilt. And then we've put everything inside of it with this. This is the binding. And this is what binds the quilt all together. So this wraps around all the layers. And let me show you, I have a couple of mug rugs here that I put together with some scraps. And this is the back of the mug rug and the front of the mug rug. And you can see here, I have batting in between. This is the batting. This is the part that makes the 3 layers puffy and warm and gives it the quilt itself its depth. So this is part of the sandwich. So for a sandwich, we would have the top, which we've pieced here. We would have the back, which you see here, and then we'd have the batting that goes in between. And the top layer, the backing layer, and this batting is what completes the sandwich. So we'll call this the top of the bread, this is the bottom of the bread, and this is the meat in the middle, okay? And then when we put those 3 things together, we have these raw edges around the outside here. So this has all been trimmed and it's ready to get a binding on it. And then we attach a binding, depending on how you're doing it, to the front or the back of the quilt and stitch it. So in this case, I attached the binding to the front of the quilt, wrapped it around to the back, and I have hand stitched it down. Sometimes we attach the binding to the front of the quilt or to the back of the quilt and flip it over to the front and we stitch it down by machine. That can be done as well. So those are the layers of the quilt. And by the way, I haven't touched on the fact that we have a top behind us right now. This is also a top. And this is actually the quilt that we're going to make together in this class. So we're going to touch on that later, but I just wanted you to know this is what our intended finished product is in the class. This is a very simple quilt, and we'll put it all together at the end. So in addition to having those layers, that top, that bottom, and that middle sandwich part, we have to actually get that batting to be stabilized inside the quilt. So depending on the type of batting will depend on how much or how little of those stitching and stabilization we need in the quilt. Antique quilts oftentimes were tied, so you would put a thread down through all 3 layers and back out at the top, and you would tie it into a knot all over the quilt. And that's something we can still do today, and oftentimes is done with a lot of charities, especially for churches that do prayers and squares, because they like to tie and pray over the ties, and that binds the quilt together in a certain way. But in addition to the act of quilting, we also have the quilting stitches. So let me show you those. So as you can see, I have different pieces of blocks, some background fabric, which I call the white, all kinds of different colors, and our binding. And then what you may notice is there's a loopy stitching that runs all along this quilt. These are the quilting stitches, and you can see they run from the top all the way to the back, same stitches, same pattern, because the needle and thread goes all the way down through every single layer. I've done the same thing with my parts here that are ready to be bound. So we take our top layer, our back layer, and our batting, and we quilt through all of the layers. So I don't have a lot of quilting on this, but if we turn it over, you can see I've just gone through, because this is a small piece, I've just stitched through all of the layers here so I can hold that together. It doesn't shift, and I can make sure that the batting stays tight in the event I want to wash these. And since they're mug rugs, I'm definitely going to want to wash them. So here's some more stitching. It's harder to see on this background, but if I lift it up a little bit, just some crossed stitching and some straight line stitching that I've put on this particular piece. So they go all through the layers, and that is also called the quilting. And that is essential. When you put those 3 layers together, you really need those quilting stitches in between to keep that batting nice and stable. And that, when I go to put this quilt into the washing machine, I won't have the batting in the middle getting all ruffled up and knotting into lumps and clumps like it used to in our antique quilts. So in order to keep all of that lumpiness and coming apart and all those fibers kind of breaking down inside the quilt when we wash it, we're going to quilt down through all the stitches, the necessary amount of closeness to be able to wash that quilt or do with that quilt what we're going to do. So now that we've learned a lot about what those layers are, let me show you a few different categories of quilts that I've finished here or have here on hand so you can understand the difference in the terms of the types of quilts. Okay, so the quilt behind me, which is our beginner quilt project that we're going to do in this series, this is what we would call traditional piecing. I'll go through the parts in a minute, but it's just very simple squares, triangles, just different basic blocks, and I would call that traditional piecing. This particular block, which is 9 squares, is called a 9 patch, and a lot of these blocks have names. I have another traditionally pieced quilt in front of me. If you've watched any of my videos before, you may have seen this one. This is called marble cake, and it is made up of a different type of sets of blocks, which are these guys right here. And you can see I have squares here, and I also have another square which has triangles in the middle. And this one is a 4 patch, and this is a half square triangle. And all of these are parts and units that fit in to make a different type of block. Let's give you a little bit better view of my table here so you can see what I'm showing you. But this one is definitely a traditionally pieced quilt. Let me show you another traditionally pieced quilt. So the quilt I have in front of me now is a pattern I call Glorious Garden Lattice. And this one, again, is a very simple block. This has several borders on it. So when we have straight lines here, we call those borders. I have an inner border, a little middle border, and an outside border. And also, this one is pieced a little differently. So if we look at this one, you can see the very straight lines, and that's when you sew very straight square blocks together. This quilt here has everything set at a diamond shape, and this is what we call on point. And then what you'll notice is along the border, I have some other triangles in here, and those are the things that we add into the quilt to make that all nice and square so we can add our border. And I recognize this is a small area, so you can't see a huge amount of the quilt, but here's a decent amount of the quilt for you to see. So this is a quilt that we call on point. So it is set in such a way that the blocks are set on top of each other. Those square blocks are turned on point. So here's a section of my Bells of Terra quilt. This is a traditionally pieced applique quilt. So we'll see that these are blocks with little girl dolls on them. It has quilting around it. You can see this is called echo quilting, where you just kind of quilt around the little ladies. These are, an applique is pieces of fabric that we have stitched down, and this one is all done by hand. So this is what we call needle turn applique. And I have to tell you, there are so many different types of applique out there, but this particular form of applique is needle turn. Applique means that you're taking a piece of fabric that is a shape and attaching it to the block itself. So I've cut out a background block here, and I have attached a piece of fabric in a particular shape. For the hat, I have attached another piece of fabric for the band of the hat. You can see a band of hat here really clearly. And I've put in pieces for the dress and pieces for the ruffles of the dress. And then this one also has embroidery, hand embroidery stitches on the shoulders and the arms, which make it really lovely and pretty. Not all applique is built the same, and different types of applique exist so that those of us that enjoy needle turn can do that type of applique, or maybe we want to do something a little bit easier, a little bit quicker. So there's so many different forms of applique out there, template methods and template and starch methods and applique and reverse sewing and fusible web and so many different types of applique. And when we get into applique in that unit, we'll go over a lot of those different types. But for this video, I just want to show you what applique means. I also want to point out that some of the quilts you're going to see fit into multiple categories. So this is an applique quilt, so it fits in the applique category, but it also fits in the traditionally pieced category. Let's see some others that kind of cross those categories. So I want to show you a little bit about what hand piecing looks like, and I may have shown this in a subsequent video. These are some blocks from a La Pasacala quilt, and you can see they're not in a full quilt yet, but there are lots of different triangles and edges, and this is the back side of the quilt where you can see all of the stitching and the seams and the seam allowances. A lot of times hand quilting designs are popular, one, for portability, but also because certain different types of shapes can only be put together with kind of Y seams. So they're not easy to put together with a sewing machine. It makes them much easier to put together by hand. And this type of shape is much more like that, with these little itty bitty points that jut out and things like that. So let's look at my finished hand pieced quilt. On the table is my only real finished hand pieced quilt. All of these seams were put together by hand, and you can see some of these seams would actually have been a little bit difficult to sew in the cases of these rows. Some of them are very difficult to sew by machine. So I was very grateful I was able to do this one by hand. And those different types of Y seams, this is kind of what I'm talking about, where you have three hexagons here that converge. So you have the seam going this way and a seam going this way and one coming out, and it makes it very difficult to be able to stitch those together if they're not by hand, because of the way that you have to stitch them on machine. So this is an example of a quilt that's put together solely by hand until I got to the borders. Once I got to the borders, I sewed those by machine. This one is also machine quilted. It is not quilted by hand, and I added the binding on it by machine as well. So it is not necessary always to do all of the parts by hand. I did not do all of the parts by hand, but I did enjoy putting this one, the parts and the blocks themselves together by hand. So that's our hand-pieced project. Okay, I had to dig very deep to find this one. This quilt is an example of what a collage quilt is, and you may be thinking, collage? It's exactly what you're thinking it is. When we build collage, we take shapes and parts, sometimes paper, sometimes fabric, and we kind of cut out little shapes to create some sort of a picture or some sort of a design. And that's what I've done here with this top. And it's not even finished quilted yet, it's just the top. This is what it looks like. So I have a black background on this particular project and a border. And then from that, I pulled some different fabrics that sort of coordinate with the fabrics in the border. And these are really neatly cut shapes with decorative scissors and little bits and bobs and uneven and crooked and all of that. And this put together, all these little bits and bobs, created this beautiful vase and the flowers that are within. So this is what we would call a collage quilt, and there are lots of different types of collage quilts on the market now. There is a really amazing designer that does a tremendous amount of collage quilts, and they're all about taking little bits and scraps of fabric, using a fusible product and getting them on fabric, and then we go ahead and we quilt over it afterwards. And they're really fun to do. And as you can see from, you know, what we saw on the overhead cam, it's just a lot of like little bits and things that don't make sense, but when you put them together, they make such a beautiful picture. So that's what collage is. And this is also an applique quilt. I told you they'd be in two different categories. Now we're gonna look at what an improvisational quilt is, which, by the way, this quilt, the collage, falls into the improvisational category, because when I laid the fabrics down, I didn't know what I was gonna get. I just sort of improvisationally laid them down. All right, the quilt that I am most known for is actually both an applique quilt and an improvisational quilt, and I would consider it quite a modern quilt as well. Let's take a look at it. So this is, for the most part, that you can see, a scrap petal garden quilt. And the scrap petal garden is made of petal cuts or shapes of different bright types of fabrics on a background that isn't quite so bright. There are lots of different versions of this with solid fabrics in the background, colored fabrics in the background. This one is lots of lower volume or printable but not as dynamic in the background. And then we have these beautiful bright dynamic colors in the foreground. So this is a fusible applique, just like we saw with the last quilt, with the collage quilt. So there's a fusible product underneath all of these petals. It is attached by raw edge applique, just by stitching around the petals with a sewing machine. That can be done with any applique shape. It doesn't have to be just this quilt. So this is just another version of applique. It's also a modern quilt, and it's also improvisational, because where your flowers are, what fabrics you use to make it, whether you put a little circle in the center of your flower or you don't, doesn't really matter. You can lay this quilt out any way that you want. And that was the interesting part about writing a pattern that is improvisational, because you really want the student to, or the quilter who takes your pattern, to use it as sort of inspiration to create their own design. Kind of like with the flowers. You don't know what fabrics I'm going to have. You don't know what shapes I'm going to cut. So it's just kind of about laying it out and feeling it. And that's what improvisational quilting is all about. So the thing about quilting is it's really about you. This is a hobby that you can use to express yourself. And I think the first step is understanding the basics of putting a quilt together, the basic construction of a quilt. But after that, it's all about figuring out what you like. So you have to pick fabrics you like, the type of design style you like, whether you're a hand piecer or a sewing machine piecer, whether you love applique or hate it, whether you're a traditional, I'm just gonna get them all done and sew some stuff together and see how it goes, or if you're a perfect piecer where you want everything to be just so and super square and all those kinds of things. I am so supportive of any way that you want to quilt, or any type of quilt that you want to make, or any type of personality that you have and how you express yourself. So anything that you want to learn, you just let me know what you want to learn and we'll go ahead and teach it. And some of this stuff can't be taught. You know, slapping stuff on a board improvisationally, that's just something you just have to slap it on a board and just go. So let me show you the tools that we need to get started. And of course, those are going to be different whether you're a hand piecer or a sewing machine piecer, but we're just going to talk about the sewing machine right now, because I believe that is the general large part of the market. So we'll start there. So the first thing that you're going to need is fabric. Fabric comes in all shapes and sizes and forms. Most of it can be found on a bolt. You can also find things like pre-cuts, which are stacks of 10-inch squares, stacks of 5-inch squares, little 2.5-inch strips that everybody calls jelly rolls. And as we get into talking about different types of fabric, I'll show you all of those things so you're not confused when you walk into a quilt shop. But to start, you're going to need some fabric, and that fabric can come from anywhere. You just need 100% cotton fabric. Don't worry about where you got it. You just want to make sure that it's not super old, that it's not super brittle, that it's 100% cotton, and that'll give you the best results. There are lots of different types of weaving. Even in quilt shops, when you walk into a quilt shop and you get quilt shop quality fabric, all of the different manufacturers use different types of weaves. So they're all going to have a slightly different feel or a slightly different hand or a slightly different drape. But if you go for quilting cotton, 100% cotton, you should be good to go. You can find those things anywhere. So if someone offers you their scraps, definitely take it. You might have a stash of fabric somewhere from a relative or a friend that is willing to part with some of their stash for you. You can also find them at thrift stores. We can always hit big box stores if you need to, but there is a lot of education and a lot of help and a lot of assistance available at your local quilt shop. And of course, I love quilt shops, so I want to support them as much as possible. They are almost always owned by general individuals, and they're always happy to have your business. They keep the community employed and engaged, and it's just a wonderful little network of people. They also have a lot of education where other quilt shops in the areas are classes, sewing machine classes. Usually they know where the best repair places are. If you need repair on your sewing machine, they can send you to the right place for education. They know of guilds in the area. Sometimes they have sew-ins or sew-alongs. So they're a very valuable part of the quilting community, and you should pop in there and give them as much of your business as you can. So sewing machine is the next place that I want you to start, and there's so many different places you can get a sewing machine. I actually have a video that I've already posted on finding a sewing machine, purchasing a sewing machine, acquiring a sewing machine, all the different things that you need to know about that. And I'll go ahead and pop that video into the beginner playlist so you can watch it at your leisure. So we won't talk a lot about sewing machines, but I'm going to show you what we have here at the studio here in the Retreat Center. So these are the basic sewing machines. I have this one laying on its back, but this is the basics of what we have here at the studio. This is the Brother Pacesetter 300T. It's not important what brand it is or what model it is. It's just a basic sewing machine. It is an electronic sewing machine, so it does have a digital display that tells you stitch length and width. It has the ability to slow and speed up the machine. That's very handy if you're a beginner. We have needle up, needle down, which is perfect. We have a reverse button. We have all the basics that you need, and you can see all the stitches listed here on the side. Let's take a little closer look. This basic sewing machine has the ability to drop the feed dogs, which is great if you want to learn how to do free motion quilting. It is a low shank machine. It uses a low shank walking foot if you want to quilt your straight line quilting on your machine. You can increase or decrease the stitch width as necessary. It has all the basics that you need. So you definitely need a sewing machine. This one is very handy if you have a really heavy machine or an expensive machine, or somebody gave you one that's inside a cabinet. This one is 8 pounds, so it's really easy to carry around, which means it's easy to take to class and easy to pop in your car if you want to go to your friend's house. This one comes with an extension table. That's a plus. It's necessary, but it is a plus because it extends the area where you can lay your fabrics down to quilt. It makes it a little easier to use when you're working with blocks. This one also has a 1/4 inch seam allowance foot, and that's something that is quite vital when you're quilting. All the patterns are going to use a 1/4 inch seam allowance unless otherwise stated, and so you need the ability to use or find or have or guide a 1/4 of an inch. All that information is in our Where to Get a Sewing Machine video, which we'll put in the playlist. In addition to sewing machine and fabric, you're going to need a rotary cutter. And this one, again, comes in all shapes and forms. You definitely want one that you can open the guide and close the guide. If you can find one with an automatic guide, even better, because as a beginner, one of the most important things you're going to have to learn is how to open it to cut and how to immediately close it so you don't cut your fabric in the wrong way or your hand or other body parts. So you're definitely going to need a rotary cutter, and while you're at it, pick up at least one extra rotary blade, because beginners always nick the edge of the mat or the edge of a ruler and mess up the blade, and as soon as it stops cutting, it gets very frustrating. It makes a little hole, and then when you go to cut in a nice long seam, you have all these spots where it didn't cut all the way through, and that will make your cutting life hard, and anything that makes your life hard as a beginner is bad. So pick up an extra blade. If you nick one, you can just go ahead and put another blade in, and it's no big deal. Now, in addition to a rotary cutter, you're going to need a few of the things I have on the table before me. The first one is a mat. This is a rather large and expensive mat. It doesn't have to be an expensive mat, but you do want one that is self-healing, and you want one that is the largest mat that you can have that lays flat. Things to remember about mats: they are very susceptible to heat. So if you lean it up against a wall and it gets it all warm, it's going to warp. Once it warps, it is very difficult to fix. It can be fixed, but you need a very large tub of warm water and a flat surface to fix it. And so usually once they warp, I throw them out and have to buy a new one. And depending on the quality of the mat that you buy, they can get to be a bit expensive. So you want a mat that is at least 18 inches in one direction and 24 inches in another direction. And the reason is because you need to get that whole width of fabric when you go to cut. So don't get anything smaller than an 18 by 24. And if you have a craft room already with a great big table that you can leave your mat out like I have here, go ahead and get a bigger one because it'll just make your life easy. In addition to mat, we need rulers. Now, we don't need a lot of rulers to start. I have a couple of basics here that I believe are the basics every new quilter should have. And that is going to be two things. You're going to need a 6-inch or 6.5 inch by 24 inch ruler. That ruler will allow you to cut all of your strips and also square up the end of your fabric. It will be exactly the length you need to get on both sides of a big new fabric piece. And I'll show you what I mean by that. When fabric is sold, it's sold folded up like this. So it's folded from selvage to selvage. We'll talk about that when we get into fabric. And it's got a fold here at the end. So you can see I have the two edges of the fabric, and then up here it's attached at the fold. Fabric comes at least 40 to 45 inches wide. And so if I took a 45-inch wide fabric and I folded it in half, I would need pretty much the entire ruler to get from one end to the other. So if I'm going to square off this edge, I need my ruler sticking out over the fabric on both sides so I can run my rotary cutter all the way from one side to the other. That's also how big you need your mat to be. So that's why I suggested having a mat that's at least 24 inches and having a ruler that's at least 24 inches. And that way we can cut nice, straight, square strips. In addition to cutting those nice, straight, square strips with our long ruler, we're also going to need a square ruler. And my recommendation for a square is a 12.5 inch square. Now, it isn't necessary to have a 12.5 inch square, but almost all beginner blocks are 12.5 inches. Not every, but a lot of them. So if you have a 12.5 inch square ruler, you can pretty much square up any block that you take in a class. There are blocks that are bigger, there are blocks that are smaller, but this is in general. If you have a 12.5 inch ruler, you'll be able to trim or cut just about anything. And you're going to use these two rulers in tandem in order to square up your fabric to start. So these are great rulers to have to begin with. And then if you think you're going to get into this or you're definitely into it, the only other ruler that I would recommend, and this is optional, you don't need it at the beginning, is something a little bit smaller. And that's going to be something like this, either a 6.5 or a 7.5 inch square. The reason I suggest this is most of the time what we're going to do with our fabric is we're going to cut strips, and then we're going to turn those strips and we're going to cut them into some sort of square. And when we do that, sometimes this guy can get a little bit big. So having something a little bit smaller to square up with, that's also handy. So, but again, this isn't necessary, it's just a side. Now, the last thing you're going to need, aside from your sewing machine and a needle, and if you're sewing by hand, you just need a needle and thread, but with sewing machine, sewing machine needle, is your thread. And I have a bunch of different threads here. Now, in general, cotton thread is what we're going to get, 100% cotton thread. And they come in all kinds of different forms. Some of them are wrapped in wax, some have a polyester core. There's so many different types of threads. Now, I'm a professional. I use Aurifil thread as my piecing thread. You don't have to use that, but that's what I use. And I almost always use neutral colors. So you can see that I have gray, a khaki, and a white. These are probably all you need primarily. If you're sewing something dark, maybe the darker gray thread, all other fabrics you can sew with white and cream thread. It's really not a problem. When you need a colored thread is when you're doing some sort of a top stitch for, say, bags or something like that, where you're actually going to see the stitching on the top of the garment or on the top of the item. And in that case, you might want a color matched thread, but it is unnecessary to buy the exact color of thread or a similar coordinating color of thread to all your fabrics, because in general, you're going to have a background and you're going to have something dark, and you might put blue and orange and white together. And then in that case, what thread do you use? So remember, with piecing and quilting, all of these threads should be on the back of the quilt, on the back inside of the top. And when you're done putting everything together, you're not going to see it anyway. So neutral threads are always good. Now, I say cotton thread, but there are debates on that. And this little spool of thread right here, this one is called bottom line. And this is a thread that is designed to go inside of your bobbin. This is not a cotton thread. It is a polyester thread. And I use bottom line all the time for my bobbins. A lot of times it's used in embroidery. A bobbin thread is very specific, and embroidery designs are done usually with poly thread. And the reason is because the needle on embroidery machines goes up and down super, super fast, and a cotton thread would tend to break under that stress. So sometimes we need a polyester thread. So I will oftentimes use this in the bobbin of my machine, which means I violated my own rule and haven't used a cotton thread. But I have another thing to blow your mind. A lot of times machine quilters that actually quilt the quilts for you, put those stitches between the 3 layers, also don't use cotton thread. They use something like this, which is a polyester thread. This thread is on a spool. This thread is on a cone. There you go. So if you have a sewing machine like the one I just showed you, where the thread goes sideways, you're going to need threads that come on a spool. I have threads that stand up, and so I'm able to use cone threads. And the only difference is there's just way more thread on this than there is on this. So if you're doing a lot of piecing all day long, rather than having to swap out and change spools all the time, I just use a cone, and I sew forever on the same cone. So that's why I'm saying it. You don't need a color match thread. You can use a neutral thread, and you can just sew all day long with that. If you don't have a stand-up thread holder on your sewing machine, you're going to need a thread stand to use a cone. You do not need it to use a spool. The machine is designed to take thread off of a spool. So that's different types of thread. All of those can be talked about at a quilt store. What I want to make sure that you don't purchase, because a lot of quilt stores are also sewing machine stores, and a lot of sewing machines also do embroidery. If you walk into a sewing machine and you see a rack of thread and it's super shiny, it's almost positively an embroidery thread. That's not something you want to use for piecing your quilt. So you definitely want a piecing thread for your quilt. And if you're unsure of what to buy, you can go ahead and ask somebody in the store what is a piecing thread and what's an embroidery thread if you're confused. All right, so there's just a few other things that I wanted to talk to you about before we end this video today and our first segment in our Beginner Quilt Series. And that is coming to the hobby with a great attitude. Now, you may feel as though you can't learn new things, but you absolutely can learn new things. So I always tell my students when they come, whether they're coming to the retreat or they're coming to a class, to make sure that they come with a fantastic, positive attitude. We can do anything we put our mind to. Quilting is not difficult. It's super easy. I know I've been doing it a long time, and so it may seem like it's easy for me. Maybe it's not as easy for you, but it is not hard, okay? It's sewing straight lines with a sewing machine, and that is really not very difficult. So come to class or watch these videos with confidence that you can do all of these things. What I'm doing is not rocket science. You can definitely do it, and you can learn anything, whether you're a man or a woman or a kid or somebody who's elderly. It doesn't really matter. You have the ability to learn these things. If you've sewn before, you'll have all kinds of confidence with your sewing machine. It's really like riding a bike. It'll just take you a minute to get refamiliarized with all of that. If you're picking up a sewing machine you haven't used for 20 years, definitely check out my video on sewing machines, because you might need a little bit of maintenance, and that'll keep you from getting frustrated with the machine. So it's not about anything other than, you know, oils and gears and things that need to run. You know, they have to be used. And if they're not used, they can get a little bit gummed up. And once they get gummed up, they can cause problems that you don't need. So we definitely will get into that when we talk about getting familiar with our sewing machine and its parts and its maintenance and all of that. But you just need to know that this is an easy hobby. It's meant to be fun, and you should enjoy it. And if you're not enjoying it, we have to figure out what went wrong. If you're hanging out with people that are making you not enjoy it, you need new people. Okay? But why? Why do we need another new hobby? Well, you need another new hobby because it's very good for your cognitive health, right? When we do things like sewing and knitting and crochet and puzzles, it keeps our brain working. It keeps our cognitive abilities sharp. And as we get into our older years, if you're young and you're, you know, a teenager, or you're in your 20s and you're looking at this video, you're probably not thinking about your cognitive health now, but it's really important. Hand-eye coordination is important. Cognitive health is important. It's as important as stretching your muscles and taking a walk and eating healthy food. It helps with your brain health longevity. It's also really good in a day and age where we're spending a lot of time online in isolation after COVID. We don't get out to see people as much anymore. I mean, they deliver our groceries now. TV is instantaneous. News is instantaneous. We can learn to do everything on YouTube like you're on right now. So it's really nice having that personal interaction and that fellowship. So there's lots of different vacations that you can do with quilting. There's fellowship at your church and in your community organizations with quilting. It builds lifelong friendships. I have tons of friendships from people that I quilted with for the very first time, and it's just really good for us in general, in our health. And you can learn to make beautiful gifts that you can give to your loved ones, your family. You can also learn to make things around the house. I just made something the other day. It just brought me in mind that I made this beautiful little Christmas pillow the other day using my patchwork skills. So there are lots of little gifties and things that you can do, and maybe we'll get into that as well. Pillows and pillowcases and curtains and things, that hones your skills. If you can do quilting, you can pretty much do any of the things that you need to do around the house. And who knows, you may find out that you like garment sewing better, or you like making bags, or you like doing whatever it is that you'll like doing. But this will help you dip a toe into quilting and see if it's something that you like. Okay, next time we're going to talk about, I know we're going to talk about tools on a budget, and also learning some terms that you're going to need to be confident in your quilting. I hope that in this video you learned all the things that you wanted to learn, or maybe something you didn't know. Or if you're new, I hope that you enjoyed learning a little bit about the history of quilting, and also walking through some of those things that people are talking about that you don't know what they're talking about. If you are just getting started, I'm really excited to share the next series with you. I hope you really enjoyed this video. And if you want to find out about me, or designs that I have, or retreats that we have here, you can check out all of those and more at cabinquilters.com. Until next time, I usually say happy quilting, but we haven't started that yet. So until next time, enjoy whatever it is that you enjoy while you're learning to quilt. All right, I'll see you next time.